I will delete this file in 20 minutes. Not because it's sensitive, because after today it will be obvious. And obvious things are always dismissed as hindsight. If you pay taxes, hold dollars, or believe the word Treasury still means safety, you need to listen carefully. Interest payments just surpass defense spending. Not projected, not adjusted. Paid. That's not a statistic. That's a regime change. At 4:06 a.m., the building was dark except for the server corridor. The air had that stale, recycled chill that only exists in places designed to outlast people. On a shared screen, the cash flow ledger refreshed. Someone had flagged the line item in yellow the night before, as if color could soften what it meant. Interest on the debt. Above it, Social Security. Below it, defense. When the numbers updated, the order flipped. No alarm, no sound. Just a cursor blinking, waiting for someone to say it out loud. No one did. This is how systems cross thresholds. Quietly, without permission. The Treasury death spiral doesn't announce itself with flames. It starts with arithmetic that no longer bends. For decades, the math worked because rates were low and growth covered sins. You could borrow cheaply, roll maturities, and pretend the principal didn't matter. You could say the debt was manageable because servicing it was cheap. That sentence is now false. And when a sentence that holds an empire together becomes false, the empire doesn't collapse immediately. It improvises. I remember the internal brief. Fiscal Sustainability Update, Draft 9, circulated at 6:15 a.m. on the 42nd floor. The language was surgical, no panic words. Rising interest burden reflects normalization of rates. Normalization, as if this were a return to health. The appendix told the truth. Weighted average maturity shortened under pressure. Auction coverage thinned. Primary dealers took down more than they wanted and less than they could absorb. To keep auctions clearing, the system leaned harder on price-insensitive buyers. And when buyers don't care about price stops being information. Here's the logic the public never hears. When interest payments exceed defense spending, you're no longer funding a state. You're funding a balance sheet. Defense buys security. Interest buys time. Time is borrowed. Borrowed time compounds. Run the numbers without sentiment. 30+ trillion in debt. Roll a third of it inside 5 years. Every 1% increase in rates adds hundreds of billions to annual outlays. That money produces nothing. It doesn't build roads. It doesn't train soldiers. It doesn't generate growth. It services the past. And because it produces nothing, it must be financed by more borrowing. That is the spiral. Borrow to pay interest on borrowing. That's not policy, that's physics. In the trading room, you could feel the mood change before the screens reacted. Hands got damp. Jokes stopped landing. Someone muttered about term premiums like they were weather. The terminal froze for half a second during a curve update, and 3 heads snapped up at once. When you've lived inside systems like this, you know the difference between volatility and fragility. Volatility is loud, fragility is quiet. The official story will tell you this isn't hyperinflation, not yet. They'll say prices aren't doubling monthly. They'll point to core measures and seasonal adjustments. That's because they define hyperinflation narrowly, as a symptom. I'm telling you it begins as a process. The moment interest dominates the budget, incentives flip. The state's priority becomes financing itself. Everything else becomes negotiable. Watch what happens next. To manage interest costs, you suppress rates. To suppress rates while deficits explode, you expand the buyer base. To expand the buyer base, you change rules. Banks get regulatory relief for holding treasuries. Pensions get guidance. Insurers get encouragement. When encouragement fails, facilities appear. When facilities aren't enough, the central bank ensures orderly functioning. Orderly is code for absorption. Absorption requires balance sheets. Balance sheets require reserves. Reserves require creation. Creation requires credibility. Credibility is spent when interest eats the budget. I've seen the meeting notes where this is framed as a choice between 2 bad options. Allow yields to rise and trigger immediate fiscal stress, or cap yields and accept currency debasement over time. They don't say debasement. They say inflation tolerance. They say growth strategy. But the outcome is the same. If you cannot cut spending politically and cannot raise taxes economically, you print financially. Not in one burst, in waves calibrated to avoid revolt. This is why the death spiral accelerates. As inflation rises, rates rise. As rates rise, interest costs rise. As interest costs rise, deficits widen. As deficits widen, issuance increases. As issuance increases, yields want to rise further. To stop yields, you intervene. Intervention expands the monetary base. Expanded base feeds inflation. The loop tightens. Every attempt to slow it makes it faster. I watched a risk model spit out a warning that was immediately overridden. Scenario label, fiscal dominance onset. The assumption was that monetary policy loses independence because it must accommodate the Treasury. The model showed volatility spikes in currency markets first, then commodities, then wages lagging prices. The override comment said, tail risk. It always says tail risk until it sits in the middle. This is where behavior tells the truth, not speeches. Behavior. Foreign official buyers shortened duration. Quietly, sovereign funds diversified away from long bonds into hard assets, without announcing a strategy shift. Corporations issued debt to buy back equity before rates moved again. Insiders borrowed against assets instead of selling them. When people who understand the system stop holding long promises and start holding real things, the diagnosis is clear. Hyperinflation doesn't require wheelbarrows. It requires expectations to break. And expectations break when the public realizes that interest has first claim on the state. Once that clicks, every price becomes provisional. Sellers raise prices preemptively. Workers demand adjustments defensively. Contracts shorten. Cash stops waiting. Velocity rises not because people are greedy, but because waiting becomes expensive. The Treasury will tell you they have tools. They always do. Buybacks, maturity extension, financial repression. They can force institutions to hold debt below market rates. That works for a while. It taxes savers invisibly. It keeps nominal yields contained. But it increases inflation elsewhere. You can cap one price only by letting others float. Energy, food, housing, services. The basket shifts. The pain moves, it never disappears. On the desk, someone pulled up a chart of real rates and said nothing. The line had been negative longer than policy admits. Negative real rates are not stimulus. They are confiscation spread over time. When interest surpasses defense, confiscation becomes strategy. You'll hear that this is manageable because the country issues debt in its own currency. That argument confuses ability with consequence. Yes, you can print to pay. You always can. The question is what the unit is worth after you do. Currency is a social contract. It holds as long as people believe tomorrow's purchasing power will resemble today's. When that belief cracks, no yield can hold them. This is why the early phase looks calm. Markets rally on liquidity. Assets inflate. Headlines celebrate resilience. Meanwhile, the denominator erodes. Your paycheck buys less. Your savings lag. Your time is discounted, and because it happens unevenly, people argue about it. That argument buys the system time. Time is what it needs to entrench the new regime. I watched the defense line item fall below interest and felt a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. Defense is optional. Interest is mandatory. When the mandatory exceeds the optional, priorities are revealed, not declared. Revealed. You're told hyperinflation begins with panic. It doesn't. It begins with policy forced by math. It begins when servicing the past costs more than securing the future. From that moment, every decision is about delay. Delay the reckoning. Delay the anger. Delay the acknowledgement that promises were overissued. This is not a prediction, it's an observation. The spiral is already turning. Slowly enough to be denied. Fast enough to be fatal to anyone standing still. I'll stop here. Because what comes next is not about what it is, but what follows. The paths the system takes to survive, the signals it sends before it admits the truth, and what you can still do when interest eats the state and the currency learns to run. And here, the road splits into three paths, and every one of them leads into a narrowing funnel where choice becomes expensive and delay becomes fatal. From the outside, they will look like policy options. From inside the machine, they feel like different speeds of the same descent. On the first path, the one that will be marketed as stabilization, the Treasury survives by choreography. Rates are talked down without being cut. Auctions clear with help that never makes headlines. Maturities are extended quietly, then shortened again when demand fades. Central bank language hardens around the word orderly. The yield curve is managed like a patient on life support. Not cured, managed. Inflation doesn't explode here, it creeps. It becomes ambient. Prices don't double overnight. They reprice annually, then quarterly, then whenever suppliers feel nervous. Wages chase but never catch. Savers are told to be patient, while patience bleeds value. Asset markets float higher on liquidity, even as the currency thins. It looks like growth if you squint. It feels like decline if you live in it. This path can last years because it spreads pain thinly and rewards those closest to issuance. It works until credibility frays just enough that buyers start demanding compensation again. Then the road bends and you realize you're already on the second path, the one no press release can contain. Here, rates refuse to stay suppressed, not because policymakers lack will, but because risk demands payment. Foreign buyers step back further. Domestic institutions hit concentration limits. The marginal buyer disappears. To keep the machine running, the central bank absorbs more supply than it admits, through facilities with neutral names and technical mandates. This is where fiscal dominance becomes visible even if it's never declared. Monetary policy stops fighting inflation and starts accommodating the Treasury. Yield caps appear in practice, if not in name. The currency weakens unevenly. Imports reprice first. Commodities sniff it out and move ahead of the data. Inflation expectations detach from official targets and re-anchor to lived experience. Contracts shorten. Indexation creeps in. Once indexation arrives, inflation stops being a burst and becomes a system. On this path, the budget becomes a negotiation with reality. Interest costs swell further as issuance accelerates to fund interest itself. Tax receipts lag nominal growth because activity thins. The deficit widens in real terms, even as it looks stable in nominal ones. The spiral tightens. Every intervention to ease it pushes pressure somewhere else. Cap yields and you tax savers. Tax savers and you reduce future capital. Reduce capital and you reduce growth. Reduce growth and you widen deficits. The machine hums louder. And then there is the third path, the one nobody names because it scares the people who name things. This is where control replaces persuasion. Capital becomes sticky. Rules change fast, not dramatically. Administratively. Liquidity is directed. Savings are encouraged into approved channels. Real yields are pushed deeply negative to force spending and trap capital inside the system. Currency controls are discussed as stability tools. They arrive regionally, then nationally, then internationally under cooperative banners. On this path, inflation stops being debated and starts being managed politically. Price controls return in limited forms. Subsidies multiply to offset controls, expanding deficits further. The currency loses its role as a neutral measure and becomes a policy lever. Trust doesn't vanish overnight, it fragments. People learn where it still works and where it doesn't. The economy adapts by shrinking its formal side and expanding its informal one. That's when the numbers stop meaning what they used to mean. Now listen carefully. Do not watch speeches. Do not anchor on targets. Watch flows. Watch the front end of the curve. When short-term funding remains elevated despite intervention, liquidity is constrained. Watch auction tails. When demand weakens, even with concessions, price discovery is breaking. Watch the share of issuance absorbed by official balance sheets. When it rises persistently, the market has stepped aside. Watch commodities priced in the currency. When they trend higher, independent of growth, debasement is speaking. Watch shipping insurance and freight rates. Currency stress shows up there before it shows up in CPI. Watch labor contracts. When cost of living adjustments become standard, expectations have shifted. Watch tax collection in real terms. When receipts lag inflation, the state is running faster just to stand still. Watch behavior at the top. Not what is said, but what is done. When insiders borrow instead of hold cash. When executives prepay expenses. When institutions swap duration for tangibility. When sovereign entities diversify reserves quietly. These are not opinions. These are exits. So what do you do when you understand that the spiral is not a forecast, but a condition? You stop optimizing for nominal returns and start protecting real optionality. Optionality is the ability to wait without bleeding. Cash is not a sanctuary, but access matters. You spread access across systems so that one rule change cannot trap you. You accept that idle liquidity earns nothing and costs less than being locked into promises that reprice against you. You shorten duration everywhere you can. Long promises are where inflation hides. The longer the promise, the more politics it contains. You favor arrangements that settle quickly, transparently, and without intermediaries whose mandates can change on a weekend. You take a portion of your stored effort and remove counterparty risk entirely, not as a trade, as an insurance policy. Physical assets don't vote, don't lobby, don't require credibility. Gold has played this role across regimes because it is nobody's liability. You don't need to believe in it. You need it to exist when rules shift. You diversify jurisdictional exposure where possible. Not because escape is imminent, but because concentration is punished in transitions. Systems under stress don't fail evenly. They protect their own first. Being everywhere is impossible. Being nowhere is worse. Balance matters. You invest in skills and networks that function outside financial plumbing. Inflation taxes money. It also taxes specialization. Resilience favors adaptability. This is not romantic. It's practical. When prices move faster than contracts, flexibility is currency. And then there is the line that separates awareness from action. You stop believing that legality equals safety. Everything that happens in this spiral will be legal. It will be justified as necessary. Emergency measures will be framed as temporary. Temporary measures will be extended. Extensions will be normalized. The past will be cited to reassure you that this has happened before and past. What they won't say is that each pass leaves the currency thinner than it was. This is not about panic. Panic accelerates losses. This is about alignment. Aligning your assumptions with incentives. Aligning your plans with physics. Interest exceeding defense spending is not a headline. It is a confession. It says the state is now primarily a debtor managing itself. When a system reaches that point, it does not choose between good and bad outcomes. It chooses between bad and worse. And it chooses the one that buys time. Time for whom depends on where you stand. The final comfort they offer is inevitability. That nothing you do matters. That individuals are powerless against macro forces. That belief is convenient for systems that need compliance. It is also false. You cannot stop the spiral. You can stop it from owning you. Calm will return intermittently. Markets will rally on liquidity injections. Commentators will declare victory. Each rally will be shorter, each injection larger, each reassurance louder. That's the rhythm of decline. Loud reassurance is the drumbeat of eroding trust. When interest eats the state, money learns to move faster. When money moves faster, it leaves promises behind. The people who suffer most are those who believed patience was prudence and loyalty was safety. You still have a choice before the spiral tightens further. Not to time it, not to call the peak, but to decide whether you will be positioned as fuel or as ballast when the system leans harder on its own foundations. That choice is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It looks boring from the outside. It feels heavy because it demands responsibility. That is the cost of the last freedom left. The right to say no, and to mean it before the math finishes its work.